You get to speak, and it's really long when the other guy's talking. So I will do the best I can to fill the time. Ignatius was referenced, and the fact that he referred to people who said that Jesus only seemed to suffer. These are called the docetics. And if you look at the New Testament, the docetics are taught against in 1 John and in the book of Colossians. And so again, these were dualists. They believed that that which is matter is evil, that which is spiritual is good. They were not Christians. Again, if you want to go for these sources, it's like Robert Price was quoted. Robert Price is a mythicist. Robert Price doesn't believe Jesus existed. Why are you using Robert Price? Robert Price is a nice guy. I debated him. But Muslims have no business quoting Robert Price. You believe Jesus existed. You can't quote somebody who thinks that he didn't. The inconsistency is patent. We had the idea of a higher fulfillment somewhat mocked or put down. Here's a problem for you. The verse that you're quoting to deny the crucifixion, Surah 4:157, identifies Jesus as what? A Messiah, right? How are the people supposed to know how Jesus was the Messiah? What passages of Scripture are they to look to that would identify Jesus as Messiah that did not require a higher fulfillment than the original? Your Quran assumes those texts, and then you turn around and attempt to undercut that. That's a self-contradictory methodology. It doesn't work. Want to see another thing that doesn't work? Saying that the Psalm 22, they pierced my hands and my feet, is a later Christian addition. That doesn't work either. There's not only are there a dozen medieval Masoretic texts that say pierced hands and the feet, there is a specific scroll. It is 5-6 Hev PS from Nahal Hever, predating the Christian church, that in Hebrew says, pierced my hands and my feet. So we were told it's a later Christian edition. We have a manuscript that reads it in the Hebrew prior to the time of Christ. How can it be a later Christian edition? The reality is it is a very early reading, and you can find it in a number of those streams, and that's exactly where it comes from. That's why I read it. This idea, like I said, of having a greater fulfillment, the seed issue. He shall see his seed. If you try to ask the question, what is Isaiah 53 actually talking about? I would invite everybody. Start at Isaiah, I think it's 52:13 as I recall. The chapter division there is a little bit strange. But read it for yourself and ask yourself a question. Who is this about? Who did these things? Who will justify, make righteous the many? Who intercedes for sinners by bearing their transgressions? Who is it? Jesus himself, I applied those words to himself. If you say that, well, that was just simply Matthew, that's simply Luke, whoever it might be, then you have no idea anything Jesus ever said. And remember, you can't go there because as a Muslim, you accept that Jesus said words in the Quran that no one heard about for 600 years. And these are words that come from the first century. So you have no consistent basis for saying that Jesus didn't say the words that are attributed to him by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's just simply not there. And so, for example, one other, again, the time goes by very quickly. It was said, well, Tacitus is just repeating what Christians had told him. Just like the author of the Quran repeats what Christians told him in regards to, for example, the infancy gospel of Thomas, which ends up being quoted, the Arabic infancy gospel, which ends up being quoted in the Quran. These were Christian stories that had nothing to do with the first century, that had nothing to do with the apostles. They were simply stories. Remember the forming of the clay birds and they become alive and fly away? That's from a proto-Gnostic source. It's not from the canonical source. So if you're going to say, well, Tacitus, we just need to dismiss Tacitus because he's just repeating hearsay, and that proves the Quran is true. Now that one, I'll have to admit, caught me a little bit by surprise. So if there's anything that's disputed about the crucifixion, that proves the Quran is true. Is there anything disputed about the life of Muhammad these days? Are there not entire books being printed that say that in reality, the centerpiece of the Quran is not Mecca, but Petra? Does that prove something? It's disputed, right? There's all sorts of disputations. I was just reading a book on the authentication of hadith that calls upon Sunni Muslims to reject even mutawatir hadith because they are in contradiction to at least this individual's understanding of the Quran. There is disputation about everything. The mere existence of disputation proves nothing. And if you're going to say this proves the Quran because Tacitus heard these stories from Christians, what that proves is a secular source accepted those stories from the Christians he was talking to, which means the Christians of his day were saying those things. That's all we're saying. To try to tie that in to the words of Surah 4, 157, I think is very dangerous for you. Because right now, a lot of attention is being placed upon the origins of the Quran. And a lot of questions about its geography and things like that are coming up. You better be careful, because if you've been using one source of methodology to attack the Christian scriptures, that very same methodology may turn around and bite you in trying to defend the Quran. Have you thought about that? I think it's something you should give some serious consideration to. It wasn't just simply following after any type of supposition that other people would have. So once again, let's remind ourselves of a few things. Every source that we have for 100 years says the same thing. So Zakir didn't give me any information, any documentary information about who these Christians were that were saying other things. Well, Ignatius mentions the Docetics. Okay, Docetics weren't Christians. Docetics, they can't even enter into our conversation because Docetics deny what you and I, as Muslims and Christians, believe. Isn't the most fundamental thing that God created the heavens and the earth? We have a creator. Isn't that part of the... They deny that the creator is a good being. That's fundamentally, they're outside the realm. You're not quoting them as your source, are you? I certainly hope not. So what documented sources do you have? You don't. What you have is sort of a Jewish approach that says, well, there's a different way of interpreting prophecy. We can limit prophecy to just the words of the prophecy itself, and it can't have any greater fulfillment, and so it has to be limited. The problem is that results in an inability on your part to have anything that's a prophecy about Jesus as the Messiah, who he was, and yet the Quran assumes all of those things. It just creates tremendous havoc within your own system. We cannot use arguments against someone else's system that creates havoc within our own. That is a demonstration. Well, a long time ago I mentioned it, and I've mentioned it about every debate ever since then. Inconsistency is a sign of a failed argument. If you're using argumentation against others that decimates your own position, you have a problem. So what do we have? We have Jesus, who you believe as a Muslim is a prophet. And we have him prophesying of his own crucifixion and resurrection. You simply have to reject those words, while at the same time accepting those words for all your other arguments. So you have to accept what allegedly Jesus says about, well, what the gospel writers say about Simon the Cyrene, and then turn around and reject what's a few verses later when, for example, at Jesus' trial, he identifies himself as the Son of Man and identifies himself basically as the one who is worshipped back in Daniel chapter 7. How is that consistent? You're not being consistent. When you're not being consistent, you cannot make truthful claims. And that's the problem this evening. I asked all my Muslim friends here this evening, what if all those prophecies were right? What if all that documentation going back to the first century is right? All that stuff that's smack dab in the middle of the history, right there in the middle of Pilate and Herod and names and everything else. What if it's right? What if all Surah 4, 157 was saying is, it wasn't the Jews that killed Jesus, it was the Romans? You can't interpret it that way. What if that's the case? What are you going to do then with Jesus' own words about why he gave himself upon that cross? For the Christians in this room, if you have conversations with us, we're going to talk to you about what that self-giving of Christ means to us every single day. How here, 2,000 years later, in a completely different land, a completely different language, we live in light of what he did and what he accomplished. And we live in light of an empty tomb. There's nobody in there. Not because he was taken up. There's a completely different understanding of Rafahu, I think, that we understood in Surah 4:1-8. But not because he was taken up before he was crucified, but he has defeated death. And because he defeated death, I no longer have to fear it myself. That's the message that we have. Think about it. Thank you for listening.